When people look back on 2025, they won't remember it as the year clean energy finally won. They will remember it as the year clean energy was forced to grow up. 2025 will stand out not because of a single technological breakthrough, but because the global energy system crossed a threshold where ambition alone was no longer enough. This was the year when numbers, physics, capital costs, grid limits, and execution timelines replaced promises as the dominant language of the transition. For most of the decade leading into 2025, the energy transition was driven by momentum. Governments announced targets, corporations pledged net zero timelines. Investors poured capital into anything aligned with decarbonization. In that environment, growth was measured in announcements, gigawatts planned, and projections several decades into the future. By 2025, that era ended. The system began asking a much harder question. Not what could be built, but what could actually operate, scale, and survive economically. The clearest signal came from electricity. Global power demand continued to rise rapidly, driven by electrification, data centers, AI workloads, cooling demand, and industrial reshoring. In 2024, global electricity demand grew by roughly 4.3%, one of the fastest growth rates outside post-recession rebounds, and that growth carried directly into 2025. What changed was how that demand was met. Wind and solar together covered the overwhelming majority of new electricity demand growth, exceeding 90% according to International Energy System tracking. For the first time in modern history, fossil fuels were no longer the default source of marginal power growth. That shift alone will define how 2025 is remembered. Solar power in particular became impossible to ignore. Annual solar installations reached levels that would have been considered implausible just 5 years earlier. Solar generation grew at double-digit rates globally, exceeding 20% year-over-year growth in several major markets. The reason was not ideology, it was economics. In many regions, new solar was cheaper than new fossil generation, even before subsidies, and in some cases cheaper than operating existing thermal plants. That cost reality made solar less of a policy choice and more of a financial inevitability. Wind energy told a more complex story. Onshore wind continued to grow, but offshore wind faced a visible reckoning in 2025. Rising interest rates, supply chain inflation, permitting delays, and contract structures designed for a low-rate world forced multiple high-profile offshore projects to be delayed, renegotiated, or canceled. Global wind growth slowed to one of its lowest rates in decades, hovering around the mid-single digits. Rather than signaling failure, this exposed a deeper truth that would define the year. Clean energy technologies are not immune to macroeconomics. The transition is constrained by capital costs, policy design, and execution risk, just like any other infrastructure sector. Investment data reinforced this reality. Global energy investment reached approximately $3.3 trillion in 2025, with clean energy accounting for nearly two-thirds of total spending. That figure alone tells a powerful story. Clean energy was no longer a niche allocation or an ESG overlay. It was the dominant destination for new capital in the energy system. Yet the composition of that investment shifted. Investors became far more selective. Capital flowed toward projects with contracted revenues, grid access secured, and credible timelines. Speculative development without clear offtake or integration plans struggled to attract financing. Money did not disappear from clean energy, it demanded discipline. Nowhere was this more evident than in green hydrogen. For years, hydrogen had been framed as the universal decarbonization solution, capable of replacing fossil fuels across industry, transport, storage, and power. By 2025, hydrogen faced its moment of truth. Hundreds of projects had been announced globally, but far fewer reached final investment decision. The reason was not technological failure. Electrolyzers worked. Costs declined incrementally. The real constraint was system economics. Electricity prices, capacity factors, grid congestion, water availability, permitting timelines, and offtake risk converged into a hard reality. Hydrogen only works when the entire system works. The $2 per kilogram target became the industry's dividing line. In earlier years, it functioned as a slogan. In 2025, it became a survival threshold. Projects that could not realistically approach that cost struggled to justify themselves even with subsidies. Developers discovered that missing the target by a few tenths of a dollar could collapse internal rates of return. Investors began demanding granular models rather than blended averages. Governments shifted from headline capacity support toward milestone-based incentives tied to actual production. Hydrogen did not fail in 2025. Illusions about hydrogen did. Electrolyzers, once positioned as the primary bottleneck, were recontextualized. Manufacturing capacity expanded. Competition increased. Technology improved modestly, but projects still stalled. The industry realized that electrolyzers were rarely the limiting factor. Grid access, power pricing volatility, and utilization rates mattered far more. An electrolyzer operating at low capacity factor cannot compete regardless of its nameplate efficiency. This understanding fundamentally changed how hydrogen projects were evaluated. The focus shifted from equipment to integration. Batteries underwent a parallel reassessment. Deployment continued at scale, especially for short-duration storage, but 2025 clarified where batteries excel and where they struggle. Long-duration storage remained expensive and material-intensive. Degradation and replacement costs became more prominent in financial models. This forced a broader conversation about system design rather than single technology dominance. Hybrid solutions combining solar, wind, storage, flexible gas, demand response, and eventually hydrogen gained credibility. The transition began to look less like a race between technologies and more like an exercise in orchestration. Nuclear energy, particularly small modular reactors, quietly re-entered serious discussions in 2025. Not as a silver bullet and not without controversy, but as a response to system constraints. High-capacity factor generation, thermal integration, and grid stability became more valuable as variable renewables expanded. Nuclear's role was reframed not as opposition to renewables, but as complement. This reframing reflected a broader shift in mindset. The energy transition stopped being about purity and started being about reliability. Policy developments reinforced this theme. In some regions, notably the United States, political shifts introduced uncertainty for specific clean energy sectors, including offshore wind. Yet globally, momentum continued. Europe maintained aggressive deployment targets. China expanded renewable capacity at a pace unmatched in history, while beginning to show early signs of emission stabilization driven by clean power growth. India accelerated solar and grid investments. Japan introduced targeted subsidies to support clean industrial clusters. The lesson of 2025 was clear. While policy can accelerate or slow progress locally, the global transition is now driven primarily by economics and system necessity. Coal's trajectory illustrated this tension. Global coal demand reached a record high in 2025, driven by short-term industrial demand and energy security concerns in certain regions. At the same time, long-term projections showed coal demand peaking and declining toward 2030. This apparent contradiction underscored the transitional nature of the current moment. Coal has not vanished, but it is no longer the future growth engine. Utilities and investors increasingly treat coal assets as finite rather than expandable, a psychological shift that matters as much as any deployment statistic. Grid infrastructure emerged as one of the defining bottlenecks of 2025. Renewable generation expanded faster than transmission and distribution upgrades in many regions. Congestion increased. Curtailment became more common. These challenges did not slow renewable deployment so much as expose the need for parallel investment in grids, digitalization, and system flexibility. Energy storage, both pumped hydro and newer technologies, regained strategic importance. Grid intelligence, forecasting, and demand-side management moved from secondary concerns to central pillars of energy planning. Capital markets adapted accordingly. Financial models became more conservative. Sensitivity analyses expanded. Interest rate assumptions were no longer afterthoughts. Project finance returned to fundamentals. Cash flow timing, contract durability, and operational resilience dominated investment decisions. This discipline filtered out weaker projects while strengthening those built on solid foundations. In that sense, 2025 did not weaken the transition, it strengthened it. Language itself changed during the year. Terms like bankability, capacity factor, dispatchability, and integration risk moved from specialist circles into mainstream discussions. The industry stopped celebrating megawatts announced and started tracking megawatt hours delivered. Success was measured less by ambition and more by reliability. Clean energy ceased to be a movement and fully became infrastructure. For professionals working within the system, 2025 felt like a sorting process. Developers with realistic assumptions advanced. Those built on optimistic spreadsheets struggled. Engineers, planners, and operators gained influence relative to marketers and visionaries. This shift in power dynamics will shape the next decade of energy development far more than any single policy or technology. What makes 2025 memorable is not that the energy transition slowed, but that it clarified. The industry learned where the friction points are. It learned which assumptions were fragile. It learned that scale without integration fails and that economics without execution collapses. These lessons are uncomfortable, but they are invaluable. Years from now, when clean energy is larger, more stable, and more deeply embedded in the global economy, 2025 will stand out as the year the transition became irreversible precisely because it became honest. This was the year when clean energy stopped being judged by intention and started being judged by performance. The year when systems thinking replaced slogans. The year when the future stopped being promised and started being engineered. That is what 2025 will be remembered for.